I am very excited to be presenting today what has been the result of many hours and many hours of discussion and many pages of documents on the vision that has been developed for the DHDP. These are discussions that have happened both within the Marathon of Hope Cancer Center Network and between the Marathon of Hope and Imagia. And so today what I want to do is spend a little bit of time talking about the high level view of how we see the DHDP operating. It'll be kind of the 30,000 foot view, understanding that there are still many details that need to get sorted out. And I want to talk a little bit about different user journeys, which will describe basically how different types of users will be interacting with the DHDP and benefiting from it. And we wanted to make a particular point of focus on how the DHDP will preserve patient privacy and data security. And I'll be relying on my colleague Florent for that discussion. So I just also want to start with a bit of a disclaimer or caveat that a lot of these conversations have taken place before our current executive director and chief data officer were put into place. We've been eagerly awaiting this day so that we can hit the ground running. And so we have prepared many different recommendations on how we see the DHDP working and different structures to get it up and running. We will be sharing that with executive leadership. And in particular, the DHDP Data Committee and Technology Committee. All this to say that I believe that the vision we're presenting today is aligned with where we're going to be going in the future, but the ultimate implementation will be up to these, the leaders and the committees who will be making those decisions. But let me dive in and talk a little bit about how we achieve the goal of federating data across different institutions that exist in different jurisdictions across Canada, and how do we build a system to federate learning while keeping the data located in the locations where they're generated. And the proposal that was submitted to ICED calls for the creation and installation of what we call DHDP appliances at each of the sites participating in the DHDP network. So the appliance is digital infrastructure that will exist inside the network of each hospital and research institute that's part of the DHDP. The main purpose of this appliance is to hold tools that are common across the network, the most important of those tools being the certification service that Florent will talk about in greater detail later in this presentation. And it is also through this appliance that different data consumption networks will operate. It will be the role of the data consumption networks to ingest data, analyze it, learn from it, and then federate that learning across multiple sites. It will be the job of the DHDP and the DHDP appliance to ensure that the data consumption networks follow DHDP standards and data governance policies while engaged in those activities. Now, two data consumption networks that were called out specifically in the original application to ICED are CanDig and Evidence. CanDig is an open source project under development across Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver. It has a particular focus in distributed genomic analysis and federation of both clinical data and genomic data in order to learn from it. And Evidence is Imagia's flagship AI platform, and it specializes in federated AI model generation across clinical, imaging, and genomic data. So how will the researcher or how will people learn from data? How will people engage with the DHDP in order to engage in federated learning activities? At the 30,000 foot view, we see researchers working in hospitals, and these researchers, these investigators will interact with their local instance of the DHDP. The DHDP, their local instance will have access to local data that is contributed by their hospital. So queries, analyses that are applied in the DHDP will be applied to the local data and will generate local results. But because that DHDP appliance is connected to all others in the network, those same queries or those same analyses can be distributed across all the different nodes of the network. And at each node, that query, that analysis will engage with local data and be processed and generate local results, but then those local results will get returned back to the lead site, and what gets presented back to the researcher is the federated learning across all the sites that are participating in this particular analysis. And I want to point out that the information that is exchanged between sites is high-level aggregate data that does not represent any single patient. It is either statistical descriptions of patient cohorts, or it's model parameters, be it analytical models or AI models. We really intend that the patient level data and the identifying data in particular will not leave the individual sites, and that's our best way to protect patient privacy, which is a key mandate for the DHDP. Now, I want to drill down a little bit deeper and highlight the fact that when a researcher is interacting with their DHDP appliance, they're really interacting with the local instance of a data consumption network. So I've got the two different networks represented here, the CanDig network in green, the Imagia network in teal. And a couple of things I want to highlight here. One is that I believe the DHDP will have the flexibility that not every data consumption network needs to be deployed at every hospital. I think having some flexibility in deployment will facilitate the establishment of DHDP in different sites. But it also means that where multiple data consumption networks are operating in any given instance or any given institution, then researchers are going to have choice in which one they use. So in this particular case, if researchers focused on genomic questions, then they might want to choose the CanDig network, and their local instance of CanDig will be connected to all other instances of CanDig in the DHDP. Otherwise, if they're engaged more in radiomics based or AI model development that's focused on imaging and genomics, they might choose to use their local evidence installation, and that will be connected to all the other evidence installations in the network. Now, if we enable this level of engagement, we will have achieved a certain amount of success. What we really want to strive for is the ability for different data consumption networks to interoperate and exchange information while they're building their models. And this allows users to leverage the strengths of each network to drive precision medicine in a multi-omic world. So if we're able to build a platform that enables this level of interoperation, I think we will have really achieved a great deal of success with the promise for the DHDP. So I want to pivot now and talk about the user journeys. I'm going to talk a little bit about what researchers can expect, how we want to engage patients, and how technology providers might engage. And then I'm going to pass it off to Florent. So a researcher, in my view, can be an academic researcher working at a hospital, or it could be an industry researcher. I don't want to distinguish between the two. I think the first point of contact, or the first step, will be a registration process for that researcher so that they can be certified to use the DHDP. The exact details, of course, still need to get sorted out, but I think at a minimum, the process would involve the researcher agreeing to abide by the policies of the DHDP and attesting to that. Once registered, there'll be a process to log in, so we make sure that we know who they are. And then I think a first step in running analysis on the DHDP would be to define a specific patient cohort. This is going to be a subpopulation of all the patients that the DHDP is exposed to that meet a certain set of criteria that are required to answer the research question or questions that the researcher has. If a researcher is able to define a cohort that is sufficiently large and has sufficient statistical power, then the next step would be to initiate a research project. And I think at the very minimum, we want to collect information about what type of research is being done and what questions are being asked and what impact that project can have. Once a project is initiated, there'll be a process of accessing the data locally at each site, running analysis on that data, generating learning from that data locally, and then federating that local learning across the multiple sites. And then typical endpoint for academic research is going to be to publish that learning in scientific literature. Another possible endpoint would be commercialization of any innovation that is derived from that exercise. The application to ISAD also calls for patient engagement, a patient portal into the DHDP. Again, the first step would be a registration process so that we know who that patient is, and a login process. At the very minimum, we should aim to be showing patients the publicly available information about different projects that are being run on the DHDP. But what I really think we should be striving for is to show which projects in particular that patient's data is being used in. I think that would really promote patient engagement with the DHDP. That's a one-way flow of information. The next step beyond that is to enable two-way flow of information, and I can see a process by which patients consent to be contacted for additional research and then are able to provide feedback and additional information either through surveys or some other mechanism. And the last point I wanted to talk about is the technology provider. And this is going to be groups or companies that have technology that they want to see contributed to the DHDP. First step there, I think, would be engagement with technology office that's established by the DHDP. It'll be that office that sets the standards by which technology needs to be developed in order to be deployed to the DHDP. But once those standards are met, tool can be certified, deployed to the DHDP, used by the researchers and investigators, and then we'd enter into a cycle of continuous feedback and improvement of those tools, and there would be a continuous process of maintaining certification so that those tools can continue to be used on the DHDP. So at this point, I would like to pass the torch over to Florent, who will focus on the privacy and security aspects of the DHDP.
Thank you, Sean. So continuing on certifying tools, specifically in view of the guidelines and standards defined through or by the DHDP, one solution that we are suggesting with the group is eventually to go through what is called or referred to as a certification service. So what's a certification service? It's something that operates automatically in the backend. It is not meant to be interacted by any clinical researchers or AI scientists. It's actually meant to be operated by just third-party solution from a software perspective. And what we want to ensure is through that certification service, the DHDP can know who is accessing the network, what is accessed, and is it accessed under appropriate, let's say, mechanism. So if we go on the next slide. So essentially, being a software, it's an active safeguard for the entire network. As such, it will be deployed at each participating site. And we believe that by having any third-party solutions, again, a solution being any technology that enable particular activity across the network, we will ensure we have appropriate security and interoperability to enable collaboration. If we go on the next slide. Thank you. First and foremost, one of the desire of the DHDP is really to be able to entirely operate while data remains on-premise. So obviously this has lots of different challenges. The good thing is hospital or wherever the data is generated, that institution remains and has a full control over that data. But on our side, from a technology standpoint, what we need to enable is actually FAIR principle, and specifically in the FAIR principles to be able to have persistent identifiers across the different cohorts so that we can enable repeatable and reproducible research. We want in applicable cases to be able to really trace who does what with the data, specifically if it's appropriate as per patient consent through appropriate contracts across different technology players. And finally, when everything is distributed, the one thing you have to make sure of so that you can find and collaborate is that everybody is speaking the same language. So we'll make sure that throughout different technology providers, at least a high-level similar semantic is used for every researchers and scientists working across the DHDP, that they can find the same type of data, same type of results uniformly. On the next slide. So once hopefully everything operates whereby data stays on premise, we want to know who's using the network. So who accesses it and who is authorized to do what on the data. For that, we will not reinvent what is already established across different institutions, so we'll leverage currently authentication system inside each institution. And in that sense, the DHDP is merely an information fiduciary. So we track what happens inside the network, but really the responsibility of who is accessing the network remains with the institution that provides the appropriate authentication system. What's the role of the certification service in terms of controlling access? And this is true for every other slides. Essentially, it's a software challenge. And in that challenge, we may have, for example, virtual accounts that we submit to different solutions. And the objective for us is to see if those software solutions have implemented appropriate safety measures as it relates to controlling access, specifically for who accesses the data and what is the use of that access, and can you trace it? If we go on the next slide. Once we can control and we can ensure that a particular solution control who accesses the network, we want to make sure on what is accessed, and specifically that the what is managed appropriately. It can be patient data, it can be confidential information that is not patient data, it can be clinical results before publication that would be confidential information. And in that sense, again, a set of different challenges will be sent to the providers that say they can provide such level of control to be able to assess and make sure that any information that is contributed to the DHDP to be found by other members is done in a manner that preserves privacy and confidentiality. Again, the objective is to go from one site to another so that we can structure information in a distributed fashion, we can link information within hospitals, across hospitals, and eventually build those cohorts. So stewardship always remains with the institution. On the next slide. In the how, data is distributed. We can control who accesses the network. We make sure that that specific individual is authorized to access that specific project. We know that the data is under appropriate privacy or confidentiality protection. So we will ensure that enabling technologies as they relate to carrying either federated analytics, federated learning, distributed learning. I mean, there are lots of different ways to actually enable this type of activities across a network. And so really, the point of the certification service is to provide a couple of recommendations of verification that whatever technology enabling those activities across the network actually do not impact the quality of the research. So there's different ways to do it. What we want to make sure is that at least reproducibility of results is a guarantee, and repeatability of the same experiment provides the same results. And in itself, it is a challenge. It is a challenge if you want to enable AI learning, if you want to do data science and automate actually a little bit of back and forth between the two. If we go on the next slide, Sean, please. So once, let's say we can certify that the solution at every site can operate under those parameters, there is actually a strong responsibility that is carried by the DHDP. And that's essentially to make sure that we know exactly what happens and that what is happening is compliant with what we want. So if we go on the next slide, and this is what we refer to as the regulatory journey. The first thing is, across the network, we need to control how information is exchanged. Now, different type of information requires different level of security. And really, there is no ground to actually force everything to have the highest level of security. It could be a burden on collaboration that would not really be useful. So in that sense, the certification service, always, being a software acting in the background, is a gateway in a way. It handshakes across two different nodes, albeit two different hospitals, prior their exchange of information, saying, well, for a particular type of information, you can engage in that communication, but here is the security protocol that you should use to actually exchange this information. And finally, on the next slide, Sean, once we have the right level of security in terms of communication, we know who has access what, and we have validated that the technology is appropriate, we want to be able to trace and audit log every activity across a network that is necessary to comply with, hopefully, regulation and law. In addition to it, by providing a system that is immutable to the desired extent, we believe that we will reach appropriate accountability and adherence through this technology, and essentially reach trust by transparency. If we go on the final slide. So here, in a sense, the DHDP commitment is that technology is the enabler. Technology is actually a framework that everybody is going to benefit from so that we can have open innovation across the country. Thanks to the different journeys that Sean has presented, we hope to be inclusive of different users, albeit patients, clinical researchers, AI scientists, data scientists, with the objective as a group to really have collaboration across the country and deliver on the promise of precision medicine.